Good morning, Dr. Bharani and everyone. We are Group 31, and my name is Wong Kang Lee. Today, we will be presenting on our topic, the synergistic effect of human development, governance, and media freedom on corruption perception in India. Before we dive into the topic, let me provide an overview for our presentation. We will start with the introduction, followed by the literature review. Next, we will explain our data and methodology, proceed to the analysis and discussion, and finally conclude with our findings. In Chapter 1 Introduction, I'll provide an overview of the background of corruption from broad and narrow perspective, examine the issue or problem, emphasize the importance of this study, and outline the research question and objectives. In a broad perspective, corruption is a global challenge that hampers the development of nations and societies, infiltrating many aspects of life and affecting multiple sectors. In many developing countries, it is not given the attention it deserves, perpetuated by corrosive culture of impunity and limited political will to address it. Let's delve into the narrow perspective of corruption in India. In India, corruption is significantly prevalent and most citizens are concerned about their government's ineffective approach to addressing corruption risks. This is reflected in a Transparency International survey where 6 out of 10 people rated their government poorly, 50% to 70% reported paying bribes, and 46% admitted using personal connections to access public service. The roots of corruption in India can be traced to its colonial history, which has shaped its political and institutional structures, embedding corrupt practice in governance. As corruption undermines trust, democracy, and development, making it a critical issue, plus existing studies focus on economics and political context, while overlooking the potential impact of other sectors in reducing corruption levels. Henceforth, this study is important because it aims to analyze key factors like human development, press freedom, and governance quality on corruption in India, providing a holistic approach to understanding and reducing corruption compared to existing studies. This study also proposed data-driven policy recommendations for legislative reforms to strengthen governance, reduce corruption, and support nations' development. Our goal of this study is to explore how the human development, quality of governance, and freedom of press in India affect corruption in the country. Moreover, to find out the effect of human development on corruption in India and to understand the relationship between freedom of press and corruption in India, as well as to investigate the impacts of quality of governance on corruption in the country.
My name is Jin. Today I will present Chapter 2 Literature Review and discuss the dependent variable, which is the Corruption Perception Index, along with the independent variables, the Human Development Index, the Worldwide Governance Indicator, and the World Press Freedom Index. These independent variables were chosen for their proven theoretical and empirical relevance to corruption levels. The dependent variable is Corruption Perception Index, which is CPI. For the corruption definition, corruption hinders society growth by eroding human development, disrupting regulations, and reducing state efficiency. It weakens the rule of law, democracy, and access to services like education and healthcare. It limits transparency and undermines reliable information by restricting media independence and government oversight. And for the CPI definition, the CPI is the index that measures perceived corruption in a country's public sector and serves as a global benchmark for tracking trends and ranking nations, which relies on perception-based measures rather than actual cases of corruption. Despite its subjectivity, the CPI provides valuable insights into global corruption trends. The Corruption Perception Index has been criticized for relying on perceptions rather than actual corruption cases, with Gilman noting its subjectivity can cause bias influenced by politics, societal norms, and media portrayals. Another study subsequently emphasized that while the CPI is a variable tool for measuring corruption, cultural and contextual bias can distort its accuracy. Our first independent variable is Human Development Index, which is HDI. The theoretical study emphasizing that despite short-term benefits, corruption violates UNDP principles, causing inequity and injustice, and ultimately has a negative overall impact. Therefore, while corruption may occasionally seem to benefit human development, its overall impact remains negative. aligns with the other findings, demonstrates that corruption harms basic human rights by raising service costs and lowering service quality. Our empirical study used the methodology reveals a strong correlation coefficient and provides a positive relationship between HDI and CPI by analyzing cross-sectional data, which means higher HDI will lead to higher CPI scores, which also mean lower corruption levels. In the context of Nepal, HDI and CPI are positively correlated. As the governments enhance human development such as education, increased literacy rates, and more informed citizens, the growing awareness of corruption in Nepal highlights how human development contributes to combating corruption. Additionally, the last study conducted hypothesis testing, which also suggests improvements in HDI help curb corruption, show a significant relationship between HDI and CPI. Based on the theoretical and empirical studies, we propose two hypotheses. Null hypothesis, which suggests no significant relationship between HDI and CPI, and alternative hypothesis, which indicates a significant relationship between the two, with higher human development likely linked to lower corruption. The second independent variable is Worldwide Governance Indicator, which is WGI. The theoretical study highlighting that corruption undermines governance by favoring private or special interests over the public good. Similarly, these and other findings argue that corruption affects governance by disrupting impartiality in decision-making and administration. He notes that corruption arises more from procedural distortions than political competition. The empirical study highlights that WGI aspects, particularly control of corruption, directly shape how corruption is perceived, reinforce the inverse relationship between governance and corruption. Another study used the GEE method across 180 countries and argued that countries with stronger governance tend to have more effective anti-corruption measures, which help lower corruption levels. For these theoretical and empirical studies, the null hypothesis is there is no significant relationship between WGI and CPI. And for the alternative hypothesis is there is a significant relationship between WGI and CPI. Our last independent variable is World Press Freedom Index, WPFI. The theoretical study investigates that the role of mass media in policy, corruption, and lobby group influence during election. Limited media access weakens accountability, enabling corruption by prioritizing private interests. Further expands on earlier studies, showing that government's control of media hinders its watchdog role, which independent media reduce corruption by increasing costs for those in power. The empirical studies show that higher levels of press freedom tend to have lower levels of corruption. They noted that press freedom reduces corruption more effectively when paired with democracy. Therefore, they are having a negative relationship between press freedom and corruption. And for the null hypothesis is there is no significant relationship between WPFI and CPI. For the alternative hypothesis is there is a significant relationship between WPFI and CPI.
Hello, my name is Iris. Now I'm going to present Chapter 3, Data and Methodology, used to explore how Human Development Index, Worldwide Governance Indicator, and World Press Freedom Index affect the Corruption Perception Index in India from 2002 to 2022. Our data is sourced from credible organizations such as the TI, Transparency International, RSF, Reporters Without Borders, UNDP, United Nations Development Programs, and World Bank, covering the period from 2002 to 2022. We focus on the Corruption Perception Index as the dependent variable, a globally recognized system that measures corruption level across countries. The independent variables include the HPI, WGI, and WPFI. The HPI measures average achievement in three key areas: health, education, and living standards. The WGI provides both aggregate and individual measures of governance for over 200 countries and regions, where the WPFI measures the level of freedom available to journalists in 180 countries. Our study used the quantitative research method, which is a methodical and impartial method used to investigate phenomena and their connection through experimentations. It is aimed to identify and analyze measurable relationship between variables. Descriptive statistics are used to study the trends, patterns, and behavior of the original data. It involves central tendency measurements, measures of variability or dispersions, and measures of distributions.
Correlation analysis is a statistical approach used in research to measure the strength of the linear relationship between two variables. It looks at the relationship between HDI, WGI, and WPFI in India respectively. The degree of correlations between variables is indicated by the correlation coefficients, which has a range of -1 to +1. Multiple regression analysis determines the combined impact of several distinct variables on the corruption perception index in India, while also accounting for other relevant aspects. This model also involves CPI as the dependent variable and independent variables such as HDI, WGI, and WPFI, along with control variables. Our general multiple regression model is y equal beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 plus beta 2 x2 plus beta n xn plus error terms. Where in our study, the model can be represented as CPI equal beta 0 plus beta 1 HDI plus beta 2 WGI plus beta 3 WPFI plus error terms. Based on this model, CPI represents the dependent variable. HDI serves as the independent variable, providing a holistic view of human progress and highlighting inequalities in development. WGI represents the independent variable to assess the quality of governance. WPFI is the independent variables, evaluating the level of press freedom across countries. And lastly, the error terms indicates the discrepancy between the predicted and actual values.
My name is Ewan. Now let's move on chapter 4, analysis and discussion. This section is divided into 4 categories: descriptive statistic, Pearson correlation coefficient, multiple linear regression, and a discussion comparing our findings with the existing literature. According to a table, the average CPI is 35.33, which indicates a high level of corruption. The standard deviation of 4.68 suggests a moderate variation around the mean. The distribution is negatively skewed, with skewness of -0.41, implying that the presence of outliers affect the mean, pulling it towards the left side of the distribution. The mean of HDI is approximately 0.58, which falls within the median range of human development, defined as a 0.55 to 0.7. The data ranges from 0.5 to 0.64, indicating that HDI consistently remained within the median category throughout the period. The negatively skewed distribution with skewness of -0.33 implies that lower HDI values are more frequent. For WGI, the mean is -1.06, representing weak governance in India. The data range extends from -1.51 to -0.61, with a median of -1.06, reflecting consistent weak governance over 20 years. The positively skewed distribution with skewness of 0.17 indicates a concentration of WGI value toward the right side of the distribution. In addition, the mean of WPFI is 45.9, ranging from 26.5 to 59.66. This reveals a relatively high fluctuation in WPFI, as evidenced by a high standard deviation of 12.79. The negatively skewed distribution with skewness of -0.36 suggests that lower WPFI values are more frequent. The Pearson correlation coefficient reflects a strength and direction of the relationship between two variables. It reveals a positive and very strong correlation with a coefficient of 0.9501 between HDI and CPI. This indicates that an increase in HDI is associated with a rise in CPI, suggesting that HDI contributes to curbing corruption. Besides, WGI presents a positive and very strong correlation coefficient of 0.7482 with CPI. Lastly, there is a positive and strong correlation between WPFI and CPI as supported by a correlation coefficient of 0.6683. This suggests that a greater press freedom can lead to higher CPI, meaning a lower level of corruption. Now, moving to the multiple linear regression. The constant coefficient of negative 22.7328 represents the CPI when the effect of all IVs are excluded. The other coefficient indicates for every unit increase in the IVs, the DV will increase or decrease by a corresponding number of points. In terms of the hypothesis testing, the p-value of HDI is 0, which is lower than the significance level of 0.05. This indicates sufficient evidence to conclude that HDI is correlated with CPI. As a result, we reject the null hypothesis and conclude that there is a significant relationship between HDI and CPI. While the p-value of WGI is greater than the significance level, this result indicates insufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Therefore, there is no significant relationship between WGI and CPI. Similarly, the p-value of WPFI is higher than the significance value, indicating the null hypothesis is rejected, and there is no significant relationship between WPFI and CPI. In section 4.4, our research highlights the significant role of HDI in addressing corruption. According to our findings, HDI demonstrates a strong positive impact on CPI. In fact, our multiple regression analysis confirms that prioritizing human development can significantly reduce corruption, and these findings align with the existing literature. However, the role of governments presents a more complex picture. While WGI is often expected to influence corruption positively, our analysis shows there is no significant relationship between press freedom and corruption in India. And this finding contradicts the previous literature and may be because of lack of impartiality in political institutions, as highlighted in Rostan's studies. Moreover, previous literature also suggests that the assumption of transparency and accountability always being beneficial on corruption may be overly simplistic. In some contexts, excessive transparency can undermine trust in institutions, discouraging political participation rather than fostering it. In addition, the media's role as a watchdog also warrant closer examination. Our study found a stronger positive relationship between WPFI and CPI, underscoring the critical role of the media in holding governments accountable. However, the hypothesis testing revealed there is no significant relationship between WPFI and CPI, suggesting that the press freedom alone is insufficient to address corruption. Challenges such as political influence, safety threat to journalists, and ownership pressure often reduce the effectiveness of media in combating corruption. So that's all from chapter 4. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yi. Let's take a look at the key findings from this study on the impact of human development, press freedom, and governance quality on corruption in India. First, we an R-square value of both 85%, confirming the effectiveness of the multiple regression model in explaining the relationship between these factors and corruption. We found that human development, as measured by the Human Development Index (HDI), has a significant impact on corruption. As HDI improves, there tends to be a reduction in corruption, indicating that advancement in human development contribute to better governance. However, when it comes to the Worldwide Governance Indicator (WGI), the analysis showed no significant impact on corruption. This suggests that other external factors might be influencing corruption level in India, which requires further investigation. Lastly, press freedom, as indicated by the World Press Freedom Index (WPFI), also show no direct effect on corruption. This may be due to the complex relationship between media independence and political interference, where the private media outlets can sometimes be leveraged by politicians to further their own interests. These findings provide valuable insight into the factors that affect corruption and highlight areas for further explorations. Now, let's discuss the limitation of this study.
First, the geographical focus on India restricts the generalizability of the findings to other countries with different cultural, political, and economic contexts. Additionally, corruption in India is often underreported, which can distort the accuracy of the Corruption Perception Index (CPI). However, the CPI relies on the expert and business people surveys. Cultural and political biases can influence the result, further affecting its reliability. Another limitation is the focus on CPI on public sector corruption, overlooking the impact of corruption in the private sector. This may lead to an underestimation of the true extent of corruption in India. Finally, the model used in this study relies on a limited set of independent variables, HDI, WGI, and WPFI. It does not account for other systemic issues like tax fraud, money laundering, cross-border corruption, and others, which could play a major role in corruption dynamics. This narrow scope means the model was isolated and may fail to fully capture the complexity of corruption in real-world scenarios. Now, let's move on to the policy implication and recommendation for further research. This study highlights the correlation between higher HDI and reduced corruption. However, WGI and WPFI alone are insufficient for tackling corruption, indicating the need for systemic reforms. Government should focus on improving education, healthcare, and economic income, the key components of HDI. A well-educated population with access to healthcare and stable income reduce societal vulnerabilities and economic reliance on corrupt practices. Fostering economic stability and ensuring access to basic services are crucial for sustainable progress. Protecting media freedom is essential for combating corruption. Government must ensure the press remains independent and free from political manipulation to act as an effective corruption watchdog. Further studies should use more complex models to better assess governance impact and corruption. Additionally, analyzing HDI dimensions like education, healthcare, and income can help develop more targeted policies to effectively address corruption. In conclusion, a holistic approach focusing on human development, media freedom, and evidence-based research is vital to reducing corruption and achieving sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.